Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to 5x15. It's March, it's spring, and we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers for you this evening, each of them with an incredible story to tell. Remember that you can order copies of all of our speakers' books from Newham Bookshop, our independent bookselling partner, and details about how to do that will be posted in the chat shortly. Let's get going. Our first speaker this evening is Chris Anderson, who became the curator of the TED conference in 2001 and has since developed it as a global platform. His TED mantra, "Ideas Worth Spreading," continues to blossom on an international scale, with more than 1 billion TED Talks viewed annually. Chris has now written a book called Infectious Generosity, which blends cutting-edge psychological research with inspiring stories from his amazing career. He's here tonight to tell us all about it. Chris, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Very nice to be here. So there's a question we ask each other all the time that is arguably both dumb and dangerous. That question is, it sounds very innocent. What do you want? What do you want? Seems harmless enough, but it's an ambiguous question. The problem is that word, you. We're not simple beings, it turns out. Walt Whitman said in a phrase that has sparked a million internet memes, "I contain multitudes." Rumi said, "You're not a drop in the ocean, you are an ocean in a drop." We're a whirling mix of thoughts, emotions, instincts, and identities. And we're a social species. We are massively influenced by each other, the context of when and how we're asked that question. So, for example, if I asked you right now whether after the excellent dinner you perhaps recently consumed, you still truly desired to insert further additional calorific substances into your body, you would tell me, I guess, well, no, of course not. And yet, if I were to wave a plate in front of you, fresh from the oven, with cookies with a sort of soft swirl of chocolate right in their centers, you might be amazed to see your hand reaching out, grab one and pop it into your mouth. So, ma'am, what do you want? The simplest mental model to help us make sense of this, I think, was offered by the great psychologist Danny Kahneman. In his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he described how so much of human behavior can be described by looking at two different systems. He called them system one and system two. System one is our fast thinking selves, our instinctive selves that drive actually so much of what we do. Quick decisions, so much of what we feel, the emotions we have, how we react to people in an instant. It's all system one thinking. And then system two thinking is our reflective selves, slower, and often, it comes from the sort of frontal cortex. It's a more recent evolutionary development, we think, in our brain. So it's literally different neurological systems are in play here. But it's our storytelling selves. It's our selves that kind of rate what we've done and perhaps at the end of the day help us decide whether we feel good about the day or not. So which of these selves should we optimize for? I mean, our instinctive selves are not all bad by any means. It's often, they're often responsible for the most wonderful things that happen to us. It's often absolutely the right thing to do to let our hair down and just immerse and go with the flow. But I think ultimately it's our reflective selves which give us a greater sort of sense of meaning, purpose, fulfillment in our lives. On our deathbeds, when we ask ourselves if we've left lives that we're proud of, that's our reflective selves talking. And so I think you could argue that the single most important question we can actually ask ourselves is, how do we empower those reflective selves over our instinctive selves, or as I sometimes call them, our lizard brains? I think this process could serve as the foundational question of any educational system, actually, for it carries with it all the skills needed to manage our time, our money, our relationships, and our habits. It's foundational to the building of character. Now, in many areas of life, we've figured out how to fight this battle. We make careful dietary plans and sometimes even stick to them. We take huge efforts to try against all odds to make vegetables taste nice so that we can trick that lizard into desiring them. We hire personal trainers to guilt us into working out when we otherwise wouldn't. We read self-help books and maybe even watch TED Talks, for goodness sake, in a desperate attempt to reduce our proclivity for procrastination. We construct elaborate social mores to help us avoid turning a moment of sexual temptation into a lifetime of regret. But there is one area where I think we've so far failed to engage properly in this battle between our reflective selves and our lizard brains. The news. The news. You know, I was brought up in South Asia, and the news always felt like this extraordinary, objective, external thing delivered from afar. BBC World Service. Good evening. This is the news, read by Anthony Smythe. I mean, of course, it was objectively selected through some godlike process to give us surely the most significant developments of the day that any responsible citizen should know about. We think of the news as a completely healthy thing to engage in if we're going to participate in a democracy properly, etc., etc., etc. You know, I had a chance. I'm a journalist. That's my first job out of college anyway, before I became a media entrepreneur. And I had a chance once to work on creating a world news bulletin. And that meant editing feeds that came in from the Associated Press and Reuters and so forth. And I found myself asking, what is it that makes someone like Associated Press put a label on certain stories that they think are the big stories? So AP puts something called bulletin on what it considers the very biggest stories of the day. And I started to say, what do these things have in common? And to cut a long story short, I cracked the code, and the code is something like this. If 100 people die violently anywhere in the world, that is your big story. That's your big story of the day. And the philosopher in me started to wonder about this. Why did they just choose that to be the big story of the day? I mean, there were definitely tweaks to it. If children were involved, it could be fewer than 100 could die, still be important. If it was a natural disaster far enough away, it would have to be a lot more than 100 who would have to die, frankly, for the rest of the world to care. But basically, the formula was about that. And how do they decide that that is the most important thing of the day? I mean, for one thing, how many people do you think die from other things every day? Do you know the answer to that? Well, I can tell you the answer is 159,900. Because about 160,000 people die every single day. We don't hear about them. There's actually pretty much as much sorrow in those families as there was in the 100 that died violently. Why do those things take priority? Well, I think we know why. We have our lizard brain has this proclivity to pay attention to dramatic things, to dangers. Anything where something horrifying like that happens, we really care about it. And so we're drawn to it. But it doesn't make any logical sense. So here's another piece of news that you may not have heard that happened yesterday. Did you know that yesterday there was a soccer stadium full of 20,000 kids, and terrorists burst in, and they were about to kill every single one of those children. And they were heroically rescued by a team helicoptered in. They were medical professionals, and they pulled out all those children and saved their lives. Incredible story. You didn't hear about it, right? Well, I had some of the details exaggerated there. It wasn't actually terrorism. It was diarrhea and other preventable childhood diseases. But the numbers are right. 20,000 children's lives were saved yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that, compared with what happened just 30 years ago. We've gone from about 12 or 13 million child deaths deaths per year to below 5, thanks to the efforts of heroic people. Every day, 20,000 children's lives are saved. We don't know about this. We pay zero attention to it. So does this matter? Well, during the era of mainstream media, it didn't matter that much because quality news sources made up for the fact that they were slightly distorting our sense of what was actually happening with the world with lots of other solid news, solid reports of what's going on. But in the connected age that we're in right now, it doesn't work like that. We have entrusted the news selection process to algorithms, and algorithms learned it from us by asking us a very simple, beautiful question. What do you want? Well, what do you want when it comes to news? Let's say you're looking at 2 headlines. One of the headlines is, interesting innovation may one day impact the lives of many people. And the other is, someone you really don't like just said something really annoying. Which headline do you want? Well, of course you want the first. You do. And how horrified are you when you see your right hand reach out and click on the second? Because that's what you do. Because that's our lizard brain calling. We pay attention to threats, things that might annoy us, things that might possibly in some environment be dangerous to us. That's what we pay attention to. And the problem with that is twofold. One is that we are training the algorithm. The algorithm just discovered what humans actually want. And so they will amplify stories like that to other humans. And secondly, we are shaped by the stories we tell each other. We're storytelling creatures. This is how we think of each other, how we come to believe the world. And so it is no surprise that we have created a machine which is generating outrage and dismay and division and anger in every direction. And we have come to believe that the future is dark and dangerous and hopeless and scary. And it is getting to the point where it is existentially alarming because we cannot solve problems without trusting each other and cooperating with each other and believing in each other at least a bit. So I'm really worried about where all this has gone. This internet thing that we thought was going to bring the world together is actually driving us apart. And I can't stand that. I think there is an antidote, just about. There are ways in which we can get the good things to spread online as well. I wrote a book about this. It's called Infectious Generosity, and it is about the ways in which we can, with the right effort, trick our lizard brains a little bit into spreading the good stuff. We can figure out collectively through some of the efforts that we've made in other areas of our lives, how to engage our reflective selves and how to reveal the world that is out there of amazing humans doing absolutely wonderful, wonderful things and sharing knowledge and kindness and beauty and all manner of other things. But it's going to take a giant collective effort. If we don't engage in that effort, the algorithms will continue to gain in power. They'll be amplified further by artificial intelligence, and we will succeed in turning each other into lizards. Let's not do that. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much. That was fascinating and very inspiring. Our second speaker this evening is also thinking about generosity, about what it means to be generous to ourselves. Vincent Deary is Professor of Applied Health Psychology at Northumbria University, where he researches a range of psychosocial factors for people experiencing health conditions. He is also the author of multiple acclaimed books, including How We Are and now How We Break, which explores what happens when our minds and bodies are pushed beyond their limits. I'm sure this is something that many of us think about, and we're so glad to have Vincent here with us this evening to speak about this. Vincent, welcome.
Myself visible and audible, and I will also share my screen because I'm going to entertain you with some slideshows rather than having to stare at my face for 15 minutes. Let's see if I can make this work. There. Can everybody see that okay?
Not yet.
Oh, bugger. Sorry, folks. Jack, have you got the
Yes.
slides lined up? Could you do that for me? Ah, you star. So, good evening, everyone. Thanks for making time to listen to my talk. And when this box of books arrived at the end of last year, it was the end of a 10-year journey, which at several points I wondered if I was going to make. It's 10 years in which I've been focused on some of the stuff that Chris Anderson was just talking about, the darker side of life. I've been researching, I've been doing clinical work, I've been looking at both mental and physical health complaints and how they push us to the edge of ourselves, how they make us tremble and sometimes break. And by trembling and breaking, I simply mean that being pushed to the edge of our ability to cope with what life throws at us. And it's quite a dark focus to have. And the book is very much about how we navigate those times. So although the title is a bit bleak, it is hopeful. And it wasn't just based on the stuff I saw in the clinic. It was, or in my research, it was also in my family, my friends, my colleagues, and ultimately in myself. I saw loads of people I know struggle with mental and physical issues during that time. And so to encapsulate some of the key messages of the book, I'm just going to focus on one story, one case, and we're going to call her Anne. If you could do the next slide, Jack, that would be great. So let's talk a bit about how I came to know Anne. So part of what I've been doing for the last 10 years is working in a transdiagnostic fatigue clinic. Now, transdiagnostic is simply a fancy way of saying that whatever the cause of your fatigue, you could come and see us. A bit like whatever the cause of your pain, you could go to a pain clinic. So we were seeing people who had post-cancer fatigue. Fatigue is a really common consequence of both cancer and its treatment. We were seeing people with liver disease, people with autoimmune conditions like Sjogren's syndrome. And over the course of 10 years, we saw hundreds of people. And we, being a multidisciplinary team, there was a consultant, a OT, an occupational therapist, that is, and a physiotherapist. And then there was me working as a clinical health psychologist. And part of what I learned in the 10 years of both working in the clinic and doing research into conditions as various as head and neck cancer, fear of falling in older adults, people with an altered relationship to food and eating due to having long-term conditions, and also through observing my friends, my family, and myself, is that no two cases are the same. We are each a case of ourselves in the same way that we're each unique individuals. We tremble and we break in our own unique way, which presented a bit of challenge writing a book about it. But there are some things in common that I wanted to share with you tonight. Two things in particular that I'm going to focus on in this talk is that it's the whole of us that gets pushed to the edge. It's the whole of us that trembles and breaks. It's not just our minds, it's not just our emotions, it's also our bodies. We are biological, embodied creatures who are also embedded in a life world, and we're exquisitely sensitive as creatures to that life world we're embedded in, both emotionally and physically. So, yeah, it's as much physical as mental. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that when we focus in on Anne. And the second thing is it's rarely one thing. It sometimes is. It's sometimes the big T trauma that pushes us to the edge, but more often than not, it's the accumulation of factors. So to bring that to life a bit, let's meet Anne. So no, back one slide, Jack. I just want to talk a bit more about who Anne is. So she's a late 30s probation officer, as she was when she came to see us. Highly respected in her field and very much liked by her colleagues. A very diligent professional. And when she came to see us, she was she was physically, mentally, and emotionally wiped out. She was mentally and physically fatigued. She had a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms. She had headaches. Her cardiovascular system was all over the place. She was fainting sometimes, couldn't get out of bed. She was anxious. She was really low. So her whole body and mind were really dysregulated, for want of a better way of putting it. So that's how she came to the clinic. Give you a little bit of the background. Single mother, bringing up her now adolescent son, most of that time on her own. The son's father was a drug user, and it was no particular surprise when they split up, though she was still very fond of him. She had help from her father through that time. He was one of the main sources of her support, and she always described herself as a stoic coper. All her life, she just got on with it until she couldn't, until she came to us in the clinic. And her question for me was, what's happened to me? And the short answer is the quote from the West Wing at the bottom of the screen. A meltdown isn't when one thing goes wrong, it's when 12 things go wrong. So let's go on to the next slide and have a look at what did go wrong for Anne. If you imagine this cube as the normal working space of you and all of us, the complex system that is us, it has got a comfortable working space, which when life is fairly okay, we're comfortably in the middle of. We can take a few knocks, but we can deal with it. But then stuff can happen that begins to push us to the edge of our comfortable working space. So the first thing that happened was that Anne's father had a fall. Now, I've worked with falls, and falls are one of those things that just one experience of can really alter the course of your life. And that's what happened to Anne's dad. He became very fearful, stayed indoors more, lost confidence, became quite low, became socially isolated. Nothing dramatic in a sense, but quite a substantial change. And he went from being someone Anne relied on to someone who now relied on Anne. Then more perniciously, and maybe this is something we can all relate to, and I saw Anne during that era that we know as austerity, though it feels like it's never really ended. And she had a new boss who was a particularly zealous champion of austerity. So over the course of a year, and so loads of support staff cut, literally decimated the amount of people to help them do their job. She saw colleagues buckle under the strain of constant evaluations, constant performance reviews, colleagues going off on long-term sick, meaning there was more work for Anne to do. She was micromanaged, even though she was an incredibly capable autonomous practitioner. So the heat gradually got turned up at work. And then the straw that kind of broke the camel's back was her ex-partner and her son's father then died of a drug overdose. It was no surprise, but it was, of course, a shock. And because it was a complicated relationship, the grief was also complicated. So Anne could see, looking at all of that, when we went over the case history of this over a couple of sessions, it made more sense to her why emotionally she was pushed to the edge. But she wanted to know why her body was out of kilter as well. And that's where we come on to the next slide. And we used this model derived from compassion-focused therapy. Very simply, it says we've got three basic systems, three basic drives within us. We've got two that help us to be on, to help us do the kind of stuff that I'm doing now, to perform, to rise to challenges. That's the one on the left-hand side, the drive. When you're doing something that you like sports or a job that you're really enjoying, your hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, your HPA axis, is driving away in the background. It's the basic motor giving you the energy to do what you need to do. Your sympathetic nervous system is there to encouraging you on to do what you need to do. The other on drive is the one that Chris Anderson was referring to in the previous talk. It's the one that gets turned on by threat, by difficulty, by stress, by unpleasant challenge, and by unpleasant stuff going on for too long. Both of them were happening to Anne. And what Anne began to see was that over the last year, she had always been on. the amount of time that she actually had to have the third drive, the rest and recover and the revive drive, the off drive, that was what had gradually slipped off her radar. That was something she had gradually become incapable of doing because she had no time to do it. Also, it was something that she had never really valued in the past. She had seen rest and recovery as something that maybe weaker people needed to do, and she had always just been able to get on with it. So that idea that she needed rest and recovery was also quite alien to her. So this began to help Anne understand that being on all the time is not just a cognitive and emotional thing, it's also a physiological thing. In my trade, we call it allostatic load. Allostasis is the work that you have to do to adjust to new challenge and to change. Allostatic load is what happens when that change and that challenge keep going, when you're in too high a gear for too long. And that affects not only your emotions and your thinking, it affects your immune system, your inflammatory system, your gastrointestinal system, your cardiovascular system. And that began to help Anne make sense of why it was her body that was also out of kilter and why she was so worn out. So moving on to the next slide, let's zoom out a bit from that, because one of the things that has become clear to me over the last 10 years of thinking about this, not only in the clinic, but in myself and my colleagues and friends, is I've seen a lot of us get worn out and worn down and burnt out. I've seen very good, conscientious people find it really, really difficult to cope. And in the book, I have this chapter called The Ambient Hum of Menace, a title I stole from a New Yorker headline. And in brief, it captures some of those things that keep those on drives on all the time for all of us. There is that whole austerity climate, which anyone in the public sector will be aware of. We're all trying to do more with less. And at the same time, we're in this continuous improvement, continuous performance review culture where we're always being audited and implicitly told we're never quite good enough. So we drive ourselves harder. Certainly that's what was happening to Anne. That's what I've seen happening to colleagues. And we have that background hum of awful news. And at the same time, we're being told we're responsible for managing it. So when Anne went to her managers for help, she was sent for resilience training. And that was the turning point for Anne. Next slide, please, Jack. So it really helped Anne to be offered such an idiotic intervention for a systemic problem. She saw that she wasn't valued by the system she was part of. She was, as far as they were concerned, just a burnt out fuse. And so she began to query her own self-worth that she had always equated with productivity and just getting on with it. She began to see, and we began to question what she valued in those that she loved. And it wasn't productivity, it was stuff like kindness and gentleness. So that's what we began to work on. She began to invest what energy she had in stuff that actually gave her a sense of self-compassion, of joy, revival, recovery, and stuff that actually genuinely helped her turn off and to switch into that self-recovery. So in essence, what she did was a reorientation. She rethought her values. Most of us only do that when we're in crisis, but part of the reason I wrote this book is so that both you and me can make that reevaluation before we hit the wall. Thanks for listening.
Vincent, thank you so much for giving us so much to think about and to learn. And
thanks, Jack.
Our third speaker this evening is Colum McCann, whose 7 novels and 3 collections of short stories have been published in over 40 languages and received some of the most prestigious literary awards and honours in the world, including the National Book Award for his novel Let the Great World Spin in 2013. In his new book, he tells the story of Diane Foley, mother of American journalist James, who was kidnapped in northern Syria and murdered by ISIS in a public beheading that would ricochet in a video around the world. A testament to the power of radical empathy and moral courage, American Mother takes us inside one woman's extraordinary journey. We're honoured to have him with us tonight to tell that story, and he joins us from California. Colum, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much, and a pleasure to be on here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, it's a sunny day here in California, and I've been pondering. When I hear these wonderful stories, people tell us that the world is held together with atoms, muons, and gluons, and quarks, and all of these things that the scientists tell us hold the world together, and indeed that must be true. But it also strikes me that the world is held together with stories, and that's how we get to meet one another. And this story that I want to tell you today is a story that how I got led to this particular book. A number of images that's inspired me and shocked me, and how they all came together to lead me towards a story that I think is one of the most powerful for me that I have ever experienced. So a lot of you out there will know the photograph that I refer to when I say that in August 2014, the world had its collective soul sort of shook out when there was a picture, and actually a video and a series of pictures that ricocheted around the internet of a young American journalist by the name of Jim Foley, sitting in the desert, kneeling in the desert in Syria in an orange jumpsuit. Beside him, a man in a black balaclava holding a knife. We need not say too much more about that particular image, because we all know that what happened afterwards. But on the same day, after my inbox was flooded with this particular image, and everyone's inbox was flooded with this particular image, some friends of mine started to send me another file, and they referred to it as a picture of Jim Foley, and I didn't want to open it. But eventually it happened a few different times, and they'd been casting around on the internet, trying to figure out the life of Jim Foley, and they were all in shock. And they sent me a photograph of him in a bunker, in a military bunker somewhere. I wasn't sure where. And I looked closely at the image, and he was alive and happy. And when I looked at the image, I saw that he was reading a book that I had written called "Let the Great World Spin." Well, you can imagine what that felt like. I'm going to try to share my screen and see if I can get that particular image up on the screen. I'm not sure if I will or not. That's not the photo I wanted you to see. This is the photo I wanted you to see, and I hope that that actually works. But that's a photo of Jim in a bunker in eventually what was Afghanistan, and he was reading my book. Now you can imagine how I felt trying to balance these two images, and I lived with it for quite a while. And I printed the photograph out, and I put it on my office door, and I sort of said hello to Jim, for a few months, and tried to figure out how could I reconcile this image in my own heart. And what happened was that I decided to write to his mother, who I'd seen on TV, and I wrote her a long email saying that if ever she wanted somebody to write about her son, or if ever she wanted somebody to write about her herself, I would be glad to chat with her. And I never heard from her. As it turned out, she actually never got the email. And a few more months went by, and I saw in the New York Times that she had got a contract to write her own memoir. And I thought, okay, great, leave well enough alone. I'm very happy that she's going to get a chance to tell her story. She wants to tell her story and the story of her son. Fast forward another 6 years, and I have written a book called A Paragon, which is set actually in the Middle East. And every day in writing this book, A Paragon, I have actually consulted with Jim Foley in the photograph, and looking to him for inspiration, for guidance, for a sense that I could pull this story together. And in many ways, I was writing the story for somebody like him. And I wrote the book, and it got published, and then the pandemic came along, and I started doing stuff online. And one of these things was a Zoom with Marquette University. And Marquette University is in Wisconsin, which was the alma mater for Jim Foley. And they said to me, by the way, did you know that there's a photograph of Jim reading your novel that we we use here at the school? And I said, I did. And then they said to me, by the way, Jim's mother, Diane, is actually on this phone call. So I chatted to her for a moment, and it's one of those moments when the oxygen is taken out of the air. You get your rib cage yanked open, and your heart gets turned backwards. And I had a little chat with her, and then I called her again after that, and she told me that she had never been able to write her book. It was one of her great sorrows that she hadn't had a chance to write her book. She just couldn't put the words down. And so I sometimes I think I like to fancy myself as a bit of a story whisperer. Like, I can get people to tell their stories, and also to put a structure on them. Because the hardest thing for a writer, of course, is to find a proper structure into which to contain your story. In fact, Samuel Beckett, the Irish writer, said, it is the job of the artist now to find a form that accommodates the mess. And so I got in my car. I live in New York. I drove up to New Hampshire, where she's living, and I sat with her and her husband John for the next 2 days, and I tried to inspire her to tell her own story. However, at the end of the first day, she told me something that sort of blew my mind. She said that two of the men who had killed her son had been arrested in northern Syria. They were known as the Beatles because they were from London. They had Cockney accents, and they'd sort of become famous or infamous as a gang that kidnapped and tortured and murdered. Jihadi Johnny had been killed in a drone strike. Two of the others had been captured. They were stripped of their British citizenship. They were brought over to the United States and brought into the court system in Virginia. One of the things that Diane insisted on is that they would not be given the death penalty. And so these men took two different paths. One of them went to trial and eventually got life sentence for everything that he'd done. The other one, Alexander Cote, pled guilty. And part of his plea agreement was that he would talk to the victims or the families of victims. So Diane said to me that she was going to go down to Virginia and talk with her son's killer. And her husband John didn't want to go, and her children didn't want to go. Naturally, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do. This whole prospect is strange and very hard for a lot of us to comprehend. But I wanted to be beside her as a family friend, and also someone who could lend her support. And also, of course, I was fascinated as a journalist and a novelist. And we went down about 6 months later to Virginia, and she walked into that courthouse, right into the, through all these rooms and metal detectors and all sorts of things, into this big echoing room with no windows. And when we walked in, there were FBI agents, there were court clerks, there were defense team members, prosecutors, a lot of people in the room. And I walked with her across the room, and there sitting at the table was Alexander Cote. He was in his prison jumpsuit. He had shackles on his ankles, and he had a book and a coffee cup in front of him. And Diane went over and she sat down beside him and she said, "Hi, Alexander. It is nice to meet you." And from that moment, I have to say, everything disappeared. everybody else in that room, even myself, I felt like I disappeared as I watched this woman talk with her son's killer. They talked eventually for 3 days, a total of 3 days. And it was truly extraordinary. I got to see compassion. I got to see forgiveness. I got to see anger. I got to see hurt. I got to see confusion. All the human emotions that were there, the human heart in conflict with itself, as Faulkner would say. And this woman, Diane Foley, in front of my eyes became one of the most courageous people that I have ever come across. At the end, and I don't mind giving away the end of the story, because it's really the process of getting towards the end that is really fascinating. At the end of our 3 days together, Diane stood up, and she hadn't. We'd been. It was during COVID, and we'd been more 6 feet and then 4 feet, more than 4 feet away for a lot of the time. And she turned to go, and she said goodbye, and she said, God be with you. They talked a lot about faith and God. And then she turned and she walked across the room, and everyone froze. It's like, she was walking towards her son's killer, and she reached out her hand. And because of his faith, he was not allowed touch the hand of anybody who's not his mother, his sister, or his children. He wasn't allowed to touch another woman. But he did. He reached out his hand. He shook her hand. And the room was held in absolute silence and aspic at this particular moment. And then Diane turned to leave, and I waited. And because I'd established a little bit of a bond with him, and I said, "Why did you do that when you knew that it was against the tenets of your religion?" And he just put his head down and he said, "She's like a mother to us all," which was a beautiful phrase, but also a way to not make himself feel guilty for having shaken these tenets in any way. But it was an extraordinary moment. I felt like that all of us had flown into the window panes of our lives and just sat there stunned, and looking down and trying to pick up the various pieces of who we happen to be. It was much later that I found out that actually this photograph that had been taken of Jim Foley was taken in Afghanistan, and he was in a bunker in Afghanistan, and the guy who took the actual photograph, Jack Wilder was his name, told me that he was astounded that Jim Foley, this great young journalist, was able to sit and read a book in the middle of all the noise and clamor of Afghanistan. And I think of that photograph and where it led me intellectually, where it led me emotionally, where it still leads me now when I think about this woman, Diane Foley, and the courage that she has shown. But I also look at it and I know that Jim is actually alive in the story, because death may take away a lot of things, but it does not take away our stories. And so when I look at that photograph of him, I know that he's in the permanent act of composition, and I am linked with him forever. Thank you for the chance to tell this story, and I wish you all the best.
Colum, thank you so much. That was an incredible story and so powerful. We really appreciate you talking to us about it.
Thank you.
Our next speaker this evening is Catherine Coldstream, who's written a striking and brilliant memoir about her time as a Carmelite nun. Having converted to Catholicism in her early 20s, Catherine was a nun at a monastery for 12 years, and she's never stopped thinking about her time there during a subsequent career teaching theology, philosophy, and ethics. Catherine's book, Cloistered, offers a way of understanding the experiences that shaped her, and we're so pleased that she's here with us this evening to talk about it. Catherine, welcome.
Hello, hi. Hope you can see me. Yes, it's great to be here. Thank you so much. So it's over 20 years since I left behind the closed world that I describe in Cloistered, which is the account of my 12 years as a contemplative Carmelite nun, as Jack said. And it was a dismal grey January day, a very depressing day when I stepped beyond the grill with its bars, its walls, its keys, its barriers, and strapped into the passenger seat of my sister's car. It was one of those old Citroen deux chevaux cars, embraced an uncertain future. It was a future far away from the securities and the restrictions that I'd known as a nun. Being inside, which was a cloistered life, which meant we were secluded, or as we called it, enclosed, meant a life of dedication and protection. It meant a firm sense of purpose, but it also meant being exposed to intense levels of experience that required a certain staying power and a certain resilience. So human nature didn't stop being human nature just because you were in the cloister and wearing a floor-length habit and a sort of acres of veil and sandals. And the four walls that were there not to keep us in, but to keep the world out, which was the famous explanation of it. We were set apart from the world, offered no protection from one's inner demons and the shadow side of those 20 or so very different personalities, people all thrown together under a rather impressive Gothic roof. The proverbial bats were very much in the belfry, and I eventually realized I had no intention of leaving. So perhaps that's why I did. But I spent over a decade in this closed world that I describe. And while I've been out for 20 plus years, the book describing my time inside has only been out for a fortnight. It's been a very intense 2 weeks, during which I've been asked all sorts of questions by all sorts of people and have been exposed to a wide range of reactions to what is perceived as a very extreme and, let's face it, very anachronistic way of life. So people want to know not only why did I go in, why did I stay so long, why did I leave? Often people want to know weird bits of nitty gritty, like what did you eat for, lunch and things like that. But anyway, the other thing people want to know is what's my life like now? So the fact that one of the main reasons I wrote the book was actually to stop people asking these really awkward questions, because I hated being asked things like this earlier on. And I just wanted to be able to say to people, read the book. But anyway, that's beside the point. I still get asked these questions. So what I do is I usually start talking about God and the life of prayer, the challenges of community. But it's when I mention the word enclosure, which shares a common root with seclusion and cloister, by the way, to close in Latin is claudere. I see the frowns appear on people's faces. It's only when I start talking about the cell that the furrowed brows morph into expressions of alarm. I've seen these reactions so many times, and of course they stem from a concern for individual freedom, not to mention concern about the darker associations of the word cell. But the word cell is one we often use in modern life, whether in the context of cell phones or stem cells or other cellular realities. And the concept of a discrete and sealed off unit is obviously a very basic one. In monastic terms, a cell is simply the typically denuded, bare bedroom of a vowed religious sister or brother. Usually it's stripped completely of sort of extraneous or of decoration and distraction in order to support the interior life of the prayerful life. So the cell was a very uncluttered space and a very beautiful, focused space. It had a certain reassuring echo. I personally loved my little wooden cell, partly because no one else was allowed to enter it, which was certainly an advantage. Had a feeling of privacy, and it was free of drama. It was free of interference. It had an atmosphere of dedication, meaning you knew that something special was supposed to and was even quite likely to happen there. This all happened within the context of a life of deep contemplative prayer. I'm not talking about prayer today. I'm talking about the cell and the enclosure and living in a very separated space, which I've realized people find quite strange. But I think we need maybe not not fewer cells, but more cells in this world, because every introvert, every would-be hermit needs a room of their own, however small. I think Virginia Woolf would have agreed. And on a primal level, the cell is like a sort of nest in a way, or a rabbit hole. It's potentially a sort of home. More broadly, the enclosure of a monastery can be at its best like a Garden of Eden. You can even fall in love with that kind of place. It reassures you, it holds you, just as a friend or lover holds you with their gaze. And its holding supports you as the person you really are, your interior freedom, your creativity. Every time we put pen to paper, we see the thread of a thought emerging and some sort of creativity, is unleashed. An uncluttered space and privacy are really what we need in order to engage with and give the emerging thought our full attention. And the same goes for so many forms of work and so many human processes, sifting, mulling, thinking over deep ideas. If this makes sense on a purely human level, perhaps the concept of a separated space or an enclosure, or even a monastic cloister, might begin to look a little bit less weird and negative or life-denying. It might even begin to look like a good idea up to a point. Like all good ideas, it needs to be implemented wisely and proportionately, and in such a way that the individual is not crushed or negated by solitude, but is set free by it. For most people, the cell needs to be balanced with a healthy life in community. The early Carmelites knew this and aimed for a life that was not only eremitical, which means hermit-based, but communal. They styled themselves hermits in community, which, although it sounds like a contradiction in terms, is really just a sort of call for a very subtle balancing act between the outer and the inner lives. It was not an impossible ideal, and I still find myself seeking quiet spaces, places where I can be true to myself, my thoughts within a busy world. Not long ago, many of us were forced into situations of solitude or isolation, sometimes dreadful ones. But there were also the fact that, there were also many people who were surprised at how the experience enabled a new relationship with themselves and with their creativity. And I think, books were written, things were invented, music, albums were composed. It's been barely a year since the official end of the pandemic, but it was during those 3 years of strangely renewed seclusion that I was able to re-enter the closed world of my past experiences, to revisit the ancient cloister that still occupies my mind, to allow its echoes and its reverberations to pass through me like ghosts, some friendly, some messengers, some portents of another dimension altogether, and to write about it in a way that I hope reaches others and enriches, or at least makes some sort of sense to those who read about my time inside. Carmelite life was much more than an unforgettable experience. It formed me and it changed me and somehow reprogrammed me at a deep level. There was much there that was beautiful. Part of the programming was profoundly positive. Other parts of it have had to be let go or uprooted. And this is the really difficult and long drawn out part of it, the challenge to sift and discern and to become the person I meant to be without the support of a physical enclosure or a community structure and routine. It's the call to be a mentally and spiritually whole and healthy person. Prayer is only part of it, as are other old-fashioned sounding things like faith and hope. The experience of writing Cloistered has been a cleansing and a refreshing one, and has reinforced my lifelong impression that seclusion is a powerful precondition of certain types of spiritual processing and of deep creativity. Artists and writers have long sought it out, as have natural contemplatives, not only monks and nuns, but people in general who feel drawn to silence and the inner life, and who mull and cannot help mulling, and who seek to plumb the depths of even the most intangible experiences, using the tool of thought, contemplation, or awareness. Sometimes it can seem graced by a certain élan, something some of us call inspiration. Being a nun is an elite form of life in one sense, but you don't need to be a special kind of person to seek out seclusion in lesser or greater ways. Anyone with a certain modicum of liberty in their lives can probably find ways of being substantially alone from time to time. When the pandemic hit, I was living a busy life in Oxford. I'd just given up teaching teenagers philosophy and ethics and caring for my mum during her final illness. I was living in a relatively cramped Victorian house with my partner. The cloistered space at the top of the house, with its desk and its views, often drew me. It did me good. But when I needed a stretch of absolute quiet and guaranteed thinking time, it was the bathroom that became my cell. I didn't go for scented candles or soft music, although the odd Bruckner symphony made it through, thanks to a robust boombox. But it allowed my mind to relax, and I relaxed and unspooled in warmth and steam and solitude. These days, my cell is something I carry around with me. It's an internal reality. It's a state of mind. It's an ability to sit quietly and observe, to be present to the ticking of a clock, the wind in the trees, or the slant of the rain on the bike shed on a chilly day. The four walls of my beautiful monastic cell are long gone, like so much else that made up that rather mysterious and beautiful, but also very difficult way of life. But having spent so long in that very deep experience and having cultivated interiority in a world apart, I realized that my cell, and possibly your cell, is wherever I happen to be, wherever you happen to be. It can be in your mind, it can be in the air in which you're sitting, the silent embrace of the wordless spirit, if you believe in such things as I do. And that seems to follow me around. So I feel that the cell is where I and all of us potentially can go to sit and be and mull and to somehow engage with truth. It can be the locus of your integrity, of your creativity. So what I want to end with is just that when your life seems too cluttered or too busy or full of ugly things, of lists and obligations, remember there is a place apart that is waiting for you. There's a place that has your and only your name written on it. Remember it, seek it out, and mull on. So I hope this has been a helpful reflection on the process of writing Cloistered and what I feel is a takeaway, which is that all of us can find something like a monastic cell in our lives that will enrich us. Thank you for letting me share this with you.
That was such a helpful reflection, Catherine. Thank you. That was so compelling. Really fascinating to hear your reflections on that experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Our fifth and final speaker this evening is no stranger to 5x15, Henry Dimbleby, co-founder of Leon and director of the Sustainable Restaurant Association, which runs some of London's most successful street food markets. Henry's work with DEFRA culminated in the National Food Strategy, a policy proposal widely praised by industry-wide figures such as Yotam Ottolenghi. In his new book, Ravenous, Henry Dimbleby takes us behind the scenes to reveal the mechanisms that act together to shape the modern diet, and therefore the world. He's here tonight to talk about the disaster that could be in the future when it comes to our food systems, but also what can be done about that. Henry, thank you. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Jack, and what an incredible series of talks to follow. I wanted to talk this evening about Ravenous and the National Food Strategy. The food strategy was a piece of work I did for government, and I knew that when I went about it, I wanted to do two things. One was to tell a story, and the other was to recommend specific policies. And when you're trying to change policy, in many ways, the story is more important because policy happens in fits and starts. It can be quite random, the events that bring about a particular change of position, whereas what underlies everything is the story. And the story that we decided to tell, oh, by the way, the book came because as soon as we'd published the National Food Strategy, my wife said no one sane is going to go online and read an online government document. We had to turn it into a book. So that's what we did. And Jemima Lewis is her name. She wrote it with me. The story that we tell starts in 1945. It starts after the Second World War. There were 2.8 billion people on the planet. if you scientists looking forward at that point could see that with improvements in medication and sanitation, that the population was predicted to increase by up to 8 billion over the next 50 years. And what these scientists realized was that there wasn't going to be enough food to feed that many people up until that point in human history, when humankind had expanded. We'd simply dug up more land to feed ourselves, to plant more crops. This chart here shows from 1800 up till just that point in the war, 3 lines. The green line is the amount of land that was farmed. The grey line is the human population. The red line is the number of calories. And you could see them gradually rising pretty much together. If you went right back to the beginning of the Holocene, the period of stable climate that started in about 10,000 BC and continues to this day, you would see a similar picture. But if you look at the newspapers of the late 40s and early 50s, you see this repetition, this story of the Malthusian collapse, the fact that the population of mankind would be restricted by calorie shortage, there'd be starvation and wars of resource scarcity. What these scientists had not reckoned on was an extraordinary man, a man called Norman Borlaug, who was an American botanist. He'd grown up in Idaho during the Great Depression. He had seen hunger close up. He had seen food riots. He'd seen people starving on the streets of Idaho. And he set himself a life of trying to make sure people were fed well. And he ended up in Mexico towards the end of the Second World War, where he was sent by the Rockefeller Foundation to try and improve the farming there. And when he arrived, he wrote to his wife that the things that he had seen, and I quote, had clubbed his mind. He said that the condition of the soil and the lives of the people were terrible. They were barely scraping a living. He said, we have to do something. I don't know what to do, but we have to do something. And what he set about doing was quite simple in many ways. It was creating a new form of wheat. He had this idea that there were quite high yielding forms of wheat at the time, but they had long stems. And when the wind blew, the stems would collapse. It was called lodging, and the wheat the yield would be lost. But he thought, if I could cross that long stemmed, high yielding wheat onto a shorter stemmed wheat, and maybe also a wheat that was resistant to wheat rust, which was the worst disease that wheat could catch in those days, and actually still is, I could create a wheat that could feed these people better. And he set up 2 research stations, one down by the sea, one up in the mountains, and thus enabling him to have 2 seasons a year. And he crossed thousands and thousands and thousands of wheat strains by hand, literally cutting off the florets, tapping the pollen onto other forms of wheat, tying tiny little paper hoods onto them to keep the pollen on the wheats he was crossing. The Mexicans thought he was crazy doing this. He slept on the floor of his research hut. But by stubbornness as well as inspiration, he succeeded. And by the time he left Mexico in 1960, Mexico was self-sufficient in wheat. It was actually exporting some. It had been importing about half of its wheat before that. And this success story was repeated for rice and for maize across the world. And this created what is known as the Green Revolution. And if you look at what happened after that, you see that the land, we actually farm slightly less land than we did back in 1945, because collectivization, collective farms in Russia, when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of that went out of production. People have grown. There are now 8 billion people on the planet, and we grow about enough food to feed twice as many calories to 8 billion people from the same amount of land as we did to 2.8 billion people back in 1945. It's a miracle. It's an astonishing transformation. But almost nobody knows about Borlaug. We say in the book that if there'd been a biopic made of him, he probably would have been played by Jimmy Stewart, because he was handsome, he had a good square jaw, American teeth. But there wasn't a biopic made of him because, as our first speaker said, you don't get famous for stopping disasters. But what Borlaug wasn't to know was that the system that he created, solving the problem, as is so often the case, caused other huge problems. And the first problem that he caused was that the food system is by far the biggest cause of environmental stress globally. And one way to think about that is just to look at the number of animals on the planet. This is 10,000 BC, this chart. These circles represent the total weight of animals on the planet. Back in 10,000 BC, there were about 2.5 million people, that tiny blue circle, dwarfed by the number of wild animals. If you fast forward today, you see a very different picture, which is to the same scale. The wild animals have decreased hugely, and that was initially due to our enthusiastic hunting and megafauna, but even more recently, since 1970, for example, the farmland birds in England have halved, whereas wheat yields have doubled roughly over that time. Horses, cats, and dogs now weigh almost as much as all of the wild animals. And the animals that we breed to eat weigh at any one time twice as much as all of the people, and 20 times as much as all of the wild animals. The food system is by far the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse, by far the biggest cause of freshwater stress and pollution, the biggest cause of deforestation, of soil degradation, of the collapse of aquatic life. And after energy systems, it's the second biggest cause of climate change. It produces about 20 to 30% of our greenhouse gases every year, which leads to another quite frightening chart that was produced by the UN, by NASA, two different versions of it, which shows what yields might look like across the world of crops in a 2.5 degree climate change scenario. And what you see here is that actually wheat in the Northern Hemisphere, the yields of wheat are projected to increase. Wheat likes carbon dioxide, it likes warm weather, it likes water, although this year, this is only a projection. This year, there's a lot of wheat that hasn't gone into the ground. But in the Southern Hemisphere and the equatorial zones, rice and maize yields are expected to shrink. And this goes back to a kind of a situation that was imagined in 1945. You look at this and you think this looks like scarcity, starvation, mass migration, and even wars of resource. And it's not just the environment that this is hurting. It is our health. So this food system that produces so much plenty is now the biggest cause also of avoidable ill health. But in this country, by 2035, it's probably going to cost type 2 diabetes will cost the NHS more than treating all cancers does today. It's also the biggest cause of the 2.8 million people who are out of work permanently, of their disabilities. And so you if this plays forward, we become not only a sick but an impoverished country. And it's at this point in the book that people occasionally text me and go, "Oh God, Henry, this is really depressing." But actually, there is hope, and there is hope because we have changed the system in the past, and we are able. Therefore, we should have hope that we can change the system in the future. And the way that we need to change the system is to understand what the feedback loops are that are going wrong. And luckily, there are two, and they are very obvious. And the first is depicted in this picture: two huge global conglomerates fighting it out for our children's breakfast bellies at eye level in the supermarkets. And the reason now that 85% of the food produced by fast-moving consumer good companies is deemed too unhealthy to tell to children is because it's simply you make more money selling that stuff, because we have an appetite that is ancient and evolved to reward us with huge pleasure eating things that are high in fat and salt and sugar. And when those are calorie dense, low in insoluble fiber, they fill us up less quickly. That is the evolved mechanism. The food companies have spotted that. They make more and more of that stuff. We eat more. They make more, we eat more, they make more, and we get sick. And, you know, we now spend every year about £3.9 billion on confectionery alone, and only about £2.2 billion on fresh fruit and veg. This junk food cycle is completely dominating the system. The other thing that is going wrong is what we call the invisibility of nature. The fact that we not only is nature not visible in any of the success systems that we use, or measurements of success that we use to measure human ingenuity. It's not in your wallet. It's not in the balance sheet of companies. It's not in the way we measure GDP. We don't even try and measure it, so that we're actually, in fact, governments subsidize the destruction of nature with subsidies to industrial agriculture, to fishing, to energy. We're paying people to destroy nature. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're destroying it at such a rate. So just to end, where are we, and can we fix this? I'm actually, notwithstanding everything I've said, quite optimistic. This was a picture taking. I was in Brussels the other day at a regenerative farming conference, and the farmers were in good spirits just up the road, dumping manure and burning tires. And you might think that actually the farming transition wasn't going very well, that we weren't going to be able to create a more regenerative farming system. But actually, if you look at what's going on, governments are trying to make nature visible, and they are changing the incentives in the system. And if you look at everywhere there is a farming protest, it's because they've got that transition slightly wrong. There's slightly dumb policy, and I think that they will change that. I'm actually quite confident that if you look at the direction of travel, it is very strongly in favor of nature. On health, I may be slightly more pessimistic. I think there is a good chance that we will break the junk. If the junk food cycle is between our evolved appetite and the commercial incentives of companies, rather than tackling the latter, we may simply drug our way out of the problem with appetite suppressing drugs. And that was, I have recently been given some hope by a man called Eddie Abu, who was a weightlifter in the 80s. And Eddie's social media has gone from 500,000 at the beginning of the year to 3 million now. And literally all he does is go around supermarkets with a camera, filming the aisles of crap, filming the Mother's Day, 5-10 meters of Mother's Day chocolate, saying, look at this. What do you want to do? Why do you want to eat this shit? He says, you want to kill your mother? You want to get your inheritance early? And then he looks at the camera and he goes, wake the fuck up. Excuse me if your children are here. And I do believe that actually that we are waking up to ultra-processed food and to what the food companies are doing to our appetites, and that therefore we might, if we're lucky, get some regulation that will stop that, rather than simply drugging our way out of the problem. Thank you very much.
Henry, thank you so much. What a bracing note to end on, but also thank you for giving us reasons for hope. It was really brilliant to see it all laid out so clearly. And thank you to all of our speakers this evening. You've been fantastic. To Henry, to Catherine, to Colum, to Vincent, and to Chris. Remember that you can buy all of their books from Newham Bookshop, on sale now, and you can check the chat for details about how to do that. Please do log on to www.5by15.com to see information about our forthcoming events. And thank you again to our fantastic speakers this evening. Good night, everyone.